Hello and welcome to part 3 of my favorite varieties of 2021 from my Zone 6A Ohio garden. In today's video, I'll be featuring my favorite vegetable, annual flower, and herb varieties from the late summer garden. Be sure to check out parts 1 and 2 for my spring and early summer favorites. Now, jumping right into a favorite summer crop of many a gardener were my tomatoes. Every year I like to try as many new varieties as I can, typically ending the season with a few favorites and a few devastating failures, and this year was no exception. First, and possibly most exciting for me, were 2 varieties I tried from Fruition Seeds with Septoria leaf spot resistance. I know that's probably less exciting to some of you than it is to me, but I have been begging tomato breeders for varieties with Septoria leaf spot resistance for like a decade. And because it's not a problem in most of the major tomato growing areas of the United States, it's just not on the top priority of most companies that are breeding tomatoes. However, here in my growing area, Septoria leaf spot is one of the worst pathogens that my tomatoes suffer from every single season. I know blight gets a lot of press, and rightfully so. It's a terrible disease as well, but more often than not, my tomatoes end up with Septoria leaf spot. So when I saw these varieties in Fruition's catalog listed as resistant, I was over the moon with excitement. The first variety was called Summer Sweetheart, and Fruition actually describes this one as a large cherry or saladette type tomato. Most of the fruit that I got were larger than this, between about the 3 to 6 ounce range. But at any rate, and more importantly to me, the disease claims on this tomato of early blight, late blight, and Septoria leaf spot resistance were legit. So I honestly don't care what size the fruit was. This plant stayed healthy in my garden till mid-October, which is a feat in itself. Usually my plants are starting to go downhill a month earlier than that if I'm lucky. And probably most importantly, this one actually tasted good. It had a nice balanced flavor, a good texture, not the most mind-blowing tomato ever in terms of flavor, but for a plant to stay that healthy and that productive and have good flavor, I will take that combination. And this plant is a tall indeterminate type, so it definitely needs some support if you grow it. The second variety from Fruition Seeds was a big red beefsteak called Brandywise, and Fruition Seeds says that this one was bred at Cornell using some very, very disease-resistant lines crossed with the old heirloom favorite, Brandywine. So I was hoping for a truly disease-resistant plant with some good old-fashioned flavor. Now, unfortunately, this was the plant that shortly after transplanting, a deer decided to come along and chomp the seedling nearly completely off. So I was worried that I had lost any chance at trying this one from the start. But the plant actually rebounded, grew, ended up putting on a heavy crop a little bit later because of the stunted start to life. But this plant remained productive and healthy right up until the frost. And I did end up with big, beefy tomatoes. And I did feel like this one, in terms of eating quality, resembled an heirloom. It had a very thin, delicate skin, very juicy, but at the same time meaty flesh. Very high sugar levels, just the kind of perfect tomato for slicing a great big old hunk off of and putting on a BLT or a tomato sandwich. Now, the third tomato winner was a variety called Indigo Apple, carried by Uprising Seeds, and this was part of my Indigo tomato trial that I mentioned in the prior video. And while I didn't like the flavor quite as well as Midnight Snack, this one definitely had merits of its own. Now, most sources describe this variety as being in about the 2 to 6 ounce range. Mine definitely were on the larger side of that, especially those first primary fruit that I got off of the plant this summer. Now, the coloration of these is what struck me at first. They really are gorgeous all the way through their stages of ripening. But luckily, this one was not just a pretty face. It really had this unique fruity, tangy, really interesting flavor. Indigo apple is an indeterminate, but it is a more compact indeterminate than some of the others that I grew. So it stayed about 6 feet tall and it didn't get nearly as thick and bushy as some of the other indeterminate varieties. So it required a lot less training and pruning on my cow panel trellises. The other thing is I've read that this one does claim some blight resistance. The plants stayed relatively healthy in my trials, but definitely not as long into the season as the prior two that I mentioned. But this one did stay productive till about the beginning of October here. The fourth tomato favorite this late summer season is a variety called Rugby, available from Totally Tomatoes. And this one set itself apart at first because of its appearance. It's got this really lovely rosy raspberry pink fruit with an unusual shape. It got its name from its resemblance to the ball that you play rugby with. But it's kind of somewhere between like a paste and a slicer, but it's good for pretty much everything. This plant was very, very prolific. It had a big, heavy fruit set. The tomatoes are great for fresh eating, really sweet, nicely balanced flavor, a good meaty texture. So you can slice them up for salads or sandwiches, but they also work as a paste tomato because they do have this really nice, dense, meaty texture. So I appreciated that this would be a good choice if you only had a limited space, if you could only grow 1 or 2 varieties and you really wanted a multi-purpose variety. It was an indeterminate plant, so it continued to set fruit all season and it stayed relatively healthy. Again, it didn't have that blight and septoria leaf spot resistance, so by the end of the season, my plants definitely went downhill. But I got a lot of pickings off of those plants before they finally went down because of late season diseases. And my final tomato winner was from a series called Tutti Frutti, and it's a variety called Deep Red Desire Raisin. And this is from Pure Line Seeds. This one isn't available to the home garden market in the US yet, but I do look for it to be available fairly soon. This variety was actually bred to be vine dried. So it has a very thin, permeable skin that in some growing areas will allow you to dry and end up with these little tomato raisins right on the plant. Now, my concern, first of all, was that I was not going to end up with any fruit to even try drying, because every time that I sent my daughter out to pick tomatoes for her lunch, this was the variety that she picked. This actually ended up being a family favorite for fresh eating, but luckily, this variety ended up being super productive, so I ended up with plenty to play around with drying. Unfortunately, here in Ohio, it is just too humid, too much weird random rainfall in the middle of the summer to successfully dry tomatoes on the plant. So I picked these and brought them in and dried them in the dehydrator. My husband didn't even believe that I was giving him tomatoes the first time that I had him try these dried. They are so sweet dried. They taste more like some kind of tropical fruit. I was really, really pleasantly surprised by the flavor of these things. And speaking of varieties whose taste resemble fruit, I have to mention my favorite Tomatillo of the 2021 growing season. It was a variety called Si Quieros from Harris Seeds, and this variety is a large fruited bright green tomatillo, and the fruit have this very tangy, bright, citrusy, sweet flavor and an excellent crisp texture. And these tomatillos get about double the size of your typical green tomatillo, but they ripen early and the plant is nice and stocky and compact. For salsa verde, this one is hard to beat, but it also makes an incredible green enchilada sauce. And for an incredible taste combination, try pairing these really bright, citrusy, fruity tomatillos with smoked jalapenos. You are welcome. Now on to peppers. Peppers are typically the stars of my late season garden. Most of my peppers really don't start ripening till mid-August and onward, and I'm usually picking through all of September right up until the frost. And I had 2 late season favorites this year. The first was a variety called Triple Delight from Gurney's Seed, and in general, I tend to grow bullhorn type sweet peppers in my garden. I prefer them over typical bells because for a sweet pepper, at least here in my growing area, they tend to be easier to grow, less finicky, and I get more production off of them. And they taste exceptional. This variety I was really happy with. This is actually a mix of two different varieties that ripen from green to gold or red. And I got some really massive fruit off of this thing. I had peppers that were up to 9 inches long. Even the small ones were bigger than 6 inches. And they had a really nice, thick, sweet, juicy flesh. Excellent for fresh eating, cooking, and I froze a bunch of these as well. And of course, every single year I have to have a jalapeno or two. And the variety that I grew this year was called Perfect Rings, also from Gurney's seed. And what's cool about this variety is that it was bred specifically for rings. So the fruit is longer and more cylindrical than your typical jalapeno, so that you can get a whole bunch of nice uniform ring cuts from the fruit. And pickled jalapeno rings is probably the thing that I use the majority of my jalapenos for. So I really liked the ease of processing with this one. The other thing was just the production in general. I grew this next to just a standard jalapeno, and Perfect Rings doubled the yield of the standard jalapeno. So I was really, really impressed with it. Now on to my late season flower favorites. Everything I'm going to mention for 2021 are actually repeats. So these are things that I have grown for multiple years in my garden, and they are favorites every year, 2021 included. The first and probably most quintessentially summer flower in my late season garden is sunflowers. And my favorite for this year was Gurney's Sunny Hedge Sunflower Blend from Gurney's seed. And while there will always be a spot in my garden for great big giant towering sunflowers, I really appreciate Gurney's Sunny Hedge Sunflower because of its size. So this is a mix of varieties that stay right around 3 to 4 feet tall, and they are multi-branching plants. So you get multiple heads on one plant. And what's fun is they stay at a size where the flowers are kind of right there where you can enjoy them. My kids especially like this variety because it's just their height. And because of that multi-branching habit, this one has a longer bloom time than sunflower varieties that just put on 1 or 2 main heads. The height is also nice because I can mix these in with my other garden plants without having to worry that they're going to overwhelm or shade out their neighbors. Another bright, sunny flower in my garden is Indian Summer Rudbeckia, available from Burpee's seed. And you may have caught on in the last video that my preferred type of flower to grow is super easy, will self-sow, and requires virtually no maintenance. And Indian Summer Rudbeckia fits that bill perfectly. I didn't actually plant any of this variety in my garden in 2021. Everything that was in my garden this year were volunteer plants. So this variety readily self-sows, but when the plants are young, they're very, very easy to pull up and get rid of if they pop up in a place that you don't want them. But it is hard to beat this one for showy summer color. This puts on tons of great big 6-inch golden blooms that have contrasting dark centers. And the plants are very, very floriferous, so they put on a ton of blooms per plant. And the best thing is that these plants pretty much just laugh at heat, drought, humidity, bugs, poor soil, and just grow and bloom and bloom and bloom. My kind of flower. My next favorite is actually a series. It is the Queenie or Queen Lime Zinnia series. You'll see them referred to as both. They are the same thing. This is available from Johnny's Seed, amongst other places. This series includes a range of colors, including lime, lime blotch, lime red, lime orange, and a new lime peach, which I have not tried the peach yet. But if I had to pick a favorite color from the series, it would definitely be the lime orange. The rainbow sherbet ombre color change thing that this variety has going on is just really, really gorgeous. And like all zinnias, this series is very, very easy to grow. There's no claims as to any powdery mildew resistance with this series, but I have not had as much trouble with powdery mildew on my Queenies as I have with some of the older zinnia varieties. The plants just tend to stay really healthy and clean for the long season, and they've got really stocky stems, so they hold up well to those late summer storms. And finally, an oldie but a goodie, Heavenly Blue Morning Glory, available from Burpee Seed, is a favorite in my garden as well. Now, true sky blue is a challenging color to find in the garden, but Heavenly Blue really delivers. Now, Heavenly Blue and other Morning Glories are quite late to bloom in my garden, but well worth the wait. Now, this one is a vigorous climber, so you definitely want to provide it some support if you're growing this one. I had it on my perimeter fence, which is 5 feet tall, and by the middle of the season, I was coming in with a pruners and just hacking vines off because this thing was basically doubling over itself. So the taller support that you have for this to grow on, the better. The other thing is that morning glories in general tend to thrive in poor soil. So if you've got a spot that's not the greatest, but you still want to throw some flowers in there, give morning glories a try. For my late season herbs, I have to mention holy basil, available from Johnny's Seed. Now, you may have seen me rave about this in a prior video, but I really believe that holy basil belongs in every single person's garden. This one is super easy to grow. It will readily self-seed if you allow it to. It has an intoxicating fragrance, though full disclosure, this seems to be one of those plants that people either love or hate. I'm on the team love the scent, so I may be a little bit biased. But whether you like the scent or not, it is a bee and pollinator magnet. So this thing provides awesome forage for bees and other pollinators. They just go nuts on these plants in my garden every single year. And holy basil is an adaptogen, so it is an herb that can help the body better cope with stress, which, as far as I can tell, almost everyone in today's society can benefit from, myself included, big time. You'll also see holy basil referred to as tulsi, and one of the most popular ways to utilize this herb is just to do a tea. And you can use either the fresh leaves and flowers or dry them for later use, steep them into a tea and just enjoy it with some local honey, or even plain. It has a really nice, pleasant, mild, almost minty flavor. And of course, what would the late summer garden be without corn? This is another variety that is on repeat in my garden. Wild Violet sweet corn, available from Gurney's Seed, is an absolute favorite of mine and my entire family's. This variety was bred and released by the Crookham Company, and I actually had the privilege of trialing this one before it was released to the general market. And I fell in love with it then, and I've loved it ever since. Wild Violet is a really cool purple and white sweet corn. And unlike some of the older purple sweet, I use that term loosely, corns on the market, doesn't taste like complete garbage. This one is actually really delicious. It's my personal flavor favorite because while it is sweet and tender and fantastic, it actually retains some corn flavor. It doesn't just taste like you're biting into an ear of sugar. The trick with Wild Violet is to keep that pure purple and white coloration. You want to isolate it from other types of corn. Now, I've grown it with bicolor or yellow SH2s, and it doesn't affect the eating quality at all, but you will end up with some yellow kernels in the mix, like you can see in this picture here. Another heat-loving late summer favorite in my garden was Jing Orange Okra. Okra is a fascinating plant. If you have not had the chance to check out the book, The Whole Okra, yet, I highly recommend it. But okra actually does really, really well here in my Ohio growing conditions. It puts up with the heat, the humidity, it will grow in clay soil. I decided to give this one a try because the marketing pictures looked so pretty with those orange pods, and it didn't disappoint. I ended up really liking Jing Orange. First of all, because the plant habit is a little bit different than some of the other okras I've grown. This one stays a little more compact. It puts on multiple branches. So the plant has this nice bushy appearance. It also has these really lovely, vibrant, kind of burnt orange, reddish stems and leaf veins, which contrast really nicely with the green leaves. And of course, the gorgeous, deep reddish orange pods that it puts on. The other thing that I liked, because I tend to snack on my okra pods raw out of the garden, is that this variety seemed to be a little less mucilaginous than other okras. So it wasn't quite as slimy and weird as some okras tend to be. Now, if you're growing okra specifically for using it as a thickening agent and things like gumbos and stews, this probably wouldn't be your first choice, but for eating raw or pickling, or I like to cut mine up and just kind of stir fry it with eggs or making fried okra. It's great for those types of uses. Another late season heat lover are sweet potatoes. And this year was a lot depressing. The majority of my sweet potato crop was completely decimated by voles. And I've already got plans in the work for this year on how I'm going to deal with those little critters. Luckily, they left me a few nice big Carolina Ruby potatoes. Now, Carolina Ruby is available from Southern Exposure Seeds, and this was the first year that I grew this variety. I usually stick with my old favorite, a variety called Covington, but I was really impressed with Carolina Ruby. They had nice, big, fat spuds. It's really true to their name, gorgeous reddish skin that contrasts really beautifully with that dark orange flesh. And eating quality was excellent. These were very, very smooth, moist, high sugar, just a really nice all-around variety. So I will be growing this one again in 2022. It was also a sad, sad year for pumpkins and winter squash and similar crops. After a bumper crop in 2020, I got a little cocky and let my guard down, and the pests took full advantage. Between squash vine borer, cucumber beetles, squash bugs, diseases, it was a nightmare this year. So long story short, I lost every single pumpkin and winter squash plant that I intentionally planted. I did get a few volunteers, which was nice, but I lost everything I intentionally planted except for Early Prince pumpkin. So this one is getting big props from me for 2021 because it is the only pumpkin that I was actually able to harvest this past year. Now, Early Prince is available from Gurney Seed, and this is a big, round, orange jack-o'-lantern type pumpkin. And the nice thing about this one is it does have powdery mildew tolerance, and it is an early ripener. So you may have heard me say before, I tend to have better luck in vining crops like pumpkins and melons and cucumbers if they mature early, because it increases my chances of actually getting a harvestable crop before those pests figure out the plants are there and or the diseases set in. So the fact that Early Prince is like a 90-day pumpkin really increases my chance of success. So I was really happy to have at least one pumpkin pickable this year. Another vining crop that thankfully beat the clock for me this year is a variety of spaghetti squash called Baby, available from Renee's Garden Seeds. Now this one is mature in just 80 days, and bacterial wilt did eventually take my plants down. But by the time the disease took the plants down, I already had a very large crop of these little baby-sized spaghetti squash. And I was able to harvest everything, cure them in my greenhouse, and they're actually still holding really well in storage at mid-January. What I really liked about these, other than the fact that I just got a crop off of them, was the size. Now these are smaller than your typical spaghetti squash and about that 2-pound range. They're really nice, like 2 serving or 1 serving if I'm eating them. And while nothing will ever truly replace pasta, these are pretty tasty baked and topped with some good marinara sauce. And that wraps up my late summer favorites from the 2021 garden. I will have one more video in this series coming soon, and that will be my favorites from the fall garden. So if you're interested, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss that video. And I'd love it if you would drop a line in the comments below and share with me your favorite varieties from the 2021 garden. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.